On behalf of the Friends of Fondren Library, thank you for joining us at our annual reception to honor Rice authors, editors, composers, and artists. I'm Julie Fette, Associate Professor of French Studies, and my co-chair for this event is Professor Carl Caldwell, who's an endowed chair in the History Department. He's the director of the program in Politics, Law, and Social Thought. He's a specialist of German history, author of at least 5 books at my count, and winner of teaching awards. So with Carl, we are pleased together to introduce the panel. Carl will handle the second part of tonight's events, which is a discussion of panelists, three of our authors. We would also like to welcome all of our members and guests to tonight's event. And so we honor those members of the Rice community writ large who have contributed published works to the arts, sciences, and humanities in 2024. And after recognizing each honoree, we will introduce our panelists for the evening. The topic is Reading, Talking, Working, Structures of Everyday Life, New Work on Children's Literature, Feminist Conversations, and the Workplace. And we will then open the floor to questions from the audience, but now we will recognize our honorees. So thank you for joining. First, on our PowerPoint in alphabetical order is Krista Comer, Living West as Feminists, Conversations about the Where of Us. Robert Dees, a few works from Robert, A Brief History of England from 4000 BCE to yesterday. The Malthus Fraud, and The Power of Peasants, Economics and the Politics of Farming in Medieval Germany. Eve Dunbar, Monstrous Work and Radical Satisfaction, Black Women Writing Under Segregation. Elaine Eklund with Christopher Scheitle and Denise Daniels, Religion in a Changing Workplace. Farshid Emami, Isfahan, Architecture and Urban Experience in Early Modern Iran. Myself, Julie Fette, Gender by the Book, 21st Century French Children's Literature. Dan Flanagan, An American Tragedy. Denva Gallant, Illuminating the Vitae Patrum, The Lives of Desert Saints in 14th Century Italy. Ilana Gershon, another panelist, The Pandemic Workplace, How We Learn to be Citizens in the Office. Erin Hamilton, The Returned, Former U.S. Migrants' Lives in Mexico City. Mickey Hebel and Eden King, Working Together, Practicing the Science of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Susan Huang, The Dynamic Spread of Buddhist Print Culture, Mapping Buddhist Book Roads in China and its Neighbors. Alexander Juden, Stalking Ghosts. Ben Kush, Home, Heat, Money, God, Texas and Modern Architecture. Alexis Glynn Latner, Sixth Sense of Wonder. Cinti Lee, Field Guide to North American Flycatchers, Kingbirds and Miracus. I didn't practice that one. J.B. Mannheim, The Keystone Corner, Thomas Edison Turns 2. And Mannheim again, What's in Ted's Wallet, the newly revealed T206 baseball card collection of Thomas Edison's youngest son. Pamela Marut, God of Awe, experience the wonder of God, deepen your connection with Him, and create a brighter world with the power of A. Casey Mitchell, Foreign Agents, How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. Timothy Morton, Hell, In Search of a Christian Ecology. Real Kabbalah, Jewish Mysticism and Neo-Hasidism in Contemporary Cinema by Brian Ogren. Anthony Pinn, Death Life, Hip-Hop and Thanatological Narrations of Blackness. David Ponton, Houston and the Permanence of Segregation, an Afro-pessimist approach to urban history. Brett Schneider, Heterogeneous Constructions, Studies in Mixed Material Architecture. Kevin Schoenberger, Music, Mind, and Language in Chinese Poetry and Performance, The Voice Extended. Manning Wolf, Hunted by Proxy, A Lawyer on the Run, Action Suspense Thriller. And Manning Wolf, Killer Weed. Pedro Alvarez, and now we're in editors of journals, yeah. Environmental Science and Technology, led the editorship of a special issue, or of the journal itself. Julie Giannoloni Connor, The 9 Lives of Tito D'Amelio, edited volume. Christian Emden, editor of Nietzsche's to Dayton. Amaryllis Estrella, Harmonizing Latina Visions and Voices, Cultural Explorations of Entornos. Suzanne Gibbs, Journal of Southern History. Randall Hall, Journal of Southern History. Amy Husaby, SEL Studies in English Literature. Amy Husaby, Victoriographies. Bethany Johnson, Journal of Southern History. Frauke Josenhans, Hive Karaman, The Foreign in Us. And Frauke Josenhans, Sheila Hicks, Radical Vertical Inquiries. Another Studies in English Literature with Kelly McKisson this time. Nana Osai Opare, Editing, Socialism, Internationalism, and Development in the Third World, Envisioning Modernity in the Era of Decolonization. George Phillips, Editor-in-Chief of Structural Dynamics. Haoshin Wan, Nano Letters. Michael Wong, Environmental Science and Technology. Richmond Burton, The Past is Prologue, Schmidt Contemporary at Bravin Lee Programs. Catherine Dunleavy, A Survey of Selected Works, and now we're in the art category of exhibitions and gallery openings. Catherine Dunleavy. Ellie Johns Kroll, one of our seniors, The Story of the Mudif. Tony Brandt, Live Wire and Meeting of Minds, Musical Composition is beginning this category. Arthur Gottschalk, a number of works from him, Concerto for Tom and Sonata for Horn and Piano. Another Gottschalk, Recuerdos de Mexico, and 4 sonatas for flute and piano. And The Voice of Brubeck by Gottschalk again. And so thank you. And before I pass the mic over to Carl Caldwell, I'd just like to say to all of our honorees this evening, the Friends of Fondren Library would like to extend our congratulations and our thanks to each of you for your significant contributions. So thank you.
Going to take a minute to get mic'd up, because technology makes everything more efficient. So everyone, hello and welcome to our event today. This is oddly the 8th time I've hosted or co-hosted this discussion. So I think we've met like 22 or 24 people here. Usually in the past, it's been an occasion for me to meet people I've never met before from other parts of campus doing books I really couldn't even conceive of. This time is very different, actually. This was really exciting to me because when I looked at the list of books and I talked over with Julie, I realized I know these people, right? And furthermore, not do I know them, not only do I know them, but they're talking about things which are very closely related, even if they don't know it and even if they don't know each other. So they're already in conversation. The title of today's discussion panel is Reading, Talking, Working. In other words, we're talking about structures of everyday life, structures involving the reproduction of who we are, of what we are, of where we are. We're talking about everyday processes that form our society and our culture and our economy in one way or another. All the books are about culture and communication. All of them have political implications that go beyond the imagination of our current government. In the current event-focused atmosphere, there is little oxygen left in the room for talking about what really makes up society, what really makes up reproduction, what really makes up everyday learning, everyday discussion, everyday work. And in the end, Julie, the third estate is what matters, not the monarch. So let's open the window today to let some fresh air in and to give these ideas some space. Yes, I have an agenda. I'm going to introduce them individually as I ask the first question. So I would like to start with Julie, whom I've known forever, more or less. Julie is Associate Professor of French Studies. You saw her book up there already, the book entitled Gender by the Book, 21st Century French Children's Literature. It's interesting, of the three, I would say Julie probably writes in the most traditional social scientific style. In a sense, it's very distanced in a way from the reader. She's taking apart the way boys and girls are represented in children's books. It's also a very personal book. At least for those of us who've known her for a while, you go through and suddenly on page 243, there's a little girl reading a book. You say, hey, I know who that is, right? So I want to hear more about the personal side of this rather distanced writing. But first, Julie, how did you come to focus on the way girls and boys are represented in French children's books? What did you find out about how these books tend to represent gender?
Thanks, Carl. Let's see. That should work. Okay. So this, let's see if I can do what you do, which is put it down here. If it won't fall away. This second monograph was a huge breakout for me, actually, since my first book was concentrated in another era, interwar France and World War II. It was entirely historical by discipline, and it was focused on anti-Semitism and xenophobia in the medical and legal professions. So it was definitely a post-tenure decision to follow a new passion, and essentially begin again as a graduate student in a field with no network, no sense of the field, rather than amortize my expertise and write an incrementally different second book. So warning to the assistant professors in the room, while it might make for a more interesting career, there are definitely costs involved. And furthermore, to embrace children's literature is not exactly a power move in academia. Let's be frank. At the same time, where does all the gender discrimination we see in the workplace and society begin? In the cradle, I'd like to argue. So I believe that childhood and socialization are critical areas to study. So the book was indeed inspired by my personal life in some ways. I was raising a daughter, reading bedtime stories to her in both French and English, and without much time to pre-approve them. So I found myself tossing dreadful books off the bed across the room with terrible gender representations and onto the floor. Nearly 20 years later, I'm pleased to substitute a scholarly analysis for that exasperation. And so I'm in a French studies department, but I was trained as an historian and social scientist. I knew that I could teach myself to analyze literary and gendered representations of characters in children's literature, but I was mostly interested in how books landed in children's hands. What were all the social and political mechanisms that meant that certain books got published, certain books got stocked in libraries, got selected for prizes. So the book has 3 sections that treat 3 institutions that I think are very important in the circulation of stories and of stereotypes. Libraries, book clubs, and the children's press. The French children's press would be unrecognizable to any American child. Next to our scratchy paper highlights, which is practically the only magazine, hundreds, nearly 300 magazines, vibrant, colorful, exciting titles are on offer to French children from age 0 to 18, and they are vastly popular. 70% of French children regularly read magazines according to surveys, so I felt like I had to have a look here. So I investigate how this institutional landscape, as well as politics and some ingrained cultural beliefs in France, influence the content of children's literature. For example, one publisher has a monopoly in the children's book club market, and that book club is widely distributed in public schools. The state subsidizes book projects for certain publishers, book projects that would likely be unprofitable. So these are some factors that are specific to France. So after I dedicate a chapter to each institution, a companion chapter analyzes a sample of material from those sources published in the 21st century through a gendered lens. And my findings about gender representations in this century are pretty grim. So female characters are quite absent, if not seriously underrepresented. For example, in the book club sample, boy characters outnumber girls 3 to 1. Further, they star in more adventure plots proportionately to girl characters. 5 of the 7 comic strips in the press, in the magazine that I analyzed, feature boy protagonists, and those are recurrent comic strips, so every month. Just ingraining. Even animals, actually, especially animals, tend to be more personified in the masculine than human characters. And once we have our characters, both females and males have been stereotyped according to prescribed norms. In my findings, 80% of books in the library sample contain gender stereotypes of one kind or another according to an analytical grill that I developed that looks at behavior, relationships, imagery. Boys are definitely a little more entitled in storylines, more involved in bullying, whereas girls are valuing relationships. You know, it's all there, the stereotypes that you might expect. More concerned about beauty. Girls are interestingly often called little girls, whereas boys are almost never called little boys. In the magazine sample, when cavaliers are drawn, the males ride horses and the females ride ponies, right? You can imagine, I'm not making it up. Big differences in adult characters too is what I found, and this is my last point, notably in socio-professional status, right? So not a single book in the library sample presents a mother who's also in a paid occupation, whereas males identified by their social or professional status appear 31 times, 6 of whom are also fathers. So, you know, in the magazine sample where there's a teacher, it's often a woman, unless it's a math teacher, and then it's a man. So these are summaries, but the evidence is very detailed. So I hope that responds to your question. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you. So we're going to turn now from reading to talking, although already you notice we're talking about talking, right? Anyone who's a kid knows you do a lot of talking in those first years of reading until they memorize the book and preempt you. And then, anyway, we're going to turn next to Krista Comer, who's a professor of English and who has been here, I believe, almost exactly as long as I have, since 2004.
It's been a while.
It's 1994. It's been a while. Anyway, she has published, as you saw, a new book on living West as feminists, Conversations about the Where of Us. And we'll certainly want to hear more about the title. One thing you know about her is, about her writing, is how she's choosing these words common words and using them in different contexts. And I have a couple different questions about that. First, I wanted to talk about how you structured the book. Essentially, the book is structured as a road trip, both as a road trip, but also about place and consciousness. So the two things together. By place and consciousness, I mean the road trip is not only about where did you go, but about particular sites, particular species in the sites, particular varieties of grasses, particular architectures, and connecting with that consciousness, right? The particular histories now obliterated by time, particular events, particular associations. So it's a really interesting and really complicated book. So about the road trip, how did you come to this way of organizing the book?
So, hi everybody, it's nice to be here. It's great to be on this panel. And Carl's questions are so good. They're very generative for me to think about. Well, I mean, you tapped into what the book is really about, which is place consciousness and everything we could tease out from place consciousness. So place is a kind of politics. Place is a way to be accountable to ourselves, to our histories, to others that we care about. Place as a way into larger causes and ways to be in the world. You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? All right. So Carl has really tapped into place and consciousness as the core issues of the book. And place is very important to me. Place as a politics, I was saying, as a way of getting into our own histories, of others' histories, as a way of being accountable to one another. Place as a way of being in the world. So the book really comes out of COVID and the shutdown of universities that happened because of COVID, and the way that new forms of research seem to need to be developed, and forms that were deinstitutionalized, that didn't rely so much on institutions. The book also came out of wanting to write more of an I, like the first person, into scholarly writing, so that we can share that writing with audiences like perhaps many of you here that maybe are not professors, and also share them with our families and share them outside of universities. The book also came out of so many contemporary crises of the present moment. The murder of George Floyd was one, but also the insurrection. And for people who are doing US West studies, we know that there are other insurrections in Western states that preceded the one at the Capitol that were done by angry ranchers who were actually armed militiamen and who took over different federal buildings and live streamed it and faced very little political accountability for that. So part of the new way of doing research was to organize the book, as you say, as a road trip. And so it's part travelogue, it's part critical meditation, and the meditations came out of the stuff we were seeing as we were driving around. You know, the Dobbs decision happens while we're driving around. There's a lot of smoke in the Western Mountains and fires, and when we get to Montana, there's this way of people talking about Montana as Montana and its white problem, or Montucky. So these things seem to me in the moment to be occasions for reflection, and that out of that came the critical meditation. And then really the core of the book are these 15 interviews with scholars about their relations to place, done in a place of their choosing. And those were organized for me as a way to get to know what people were thinking as feminists about the various political events of the day, and organized, since people are very different in how they understand feminism, organized around the anchor of place and our commitments to place as a way for us to show our differences, but not in some theoretical way, but rather as a way to get to know one better. So it was a way of doing things less through argument and more through letting each other know one another better. So a couple of years of summers of driving, 13,000 miles. We went all over the place. We went to homesteads, we went to backyards, we went to campgrounds and state parks, we went to a sheep farm in Ontario, Canada. We went to a sacred site, Panhe in Southern California. And through it all, people brought us into their lives, into their homes. They gave us breakfast, they gave us dinner, they gave us their beds. And out of that started to emerge this surprising kind of relationality between everyone that I wasn't expecting, but that ultimately informed what the book is about, which is a meditation on what coalitional feminism might look like. And because the book is very collaborative, I wanted just to notice that we have Priscilla Ibarra here. She'll say something in a minute, which I'm really pleased. She came from Denton. She's a professor there, and she's just been hired away at UCSB, so we're glad you're still in town for this. And Zainab Abdali, who continues to be close to us and the research assistant for the project. And the work of transcription, which she did, is very relational work, and also shared in the conceptualization of the book. Megan Corona is someone in Alumni Affairs. She did all the artwork for the book, and she's just terrifically talented. And Jose Aranda, a professor here, my partner in life, behind the wheel of the journey. And then the final thing I would say is just thinking about recognitions that, when you drive around all over the West and all over the country, you think a lot about Indigenous studies, it comes home to you over and over and over again that everywhere we go is Indian country. And so I wanted just to take a moment to say that, today we're in the homelands of the Karankawa, and we wish to pay our respects and extend ourselves to make better relations.
Thank you, Krista. So it's interesting not talking about COVID in terms of a public health emergency, not talking about it in terms of politics, but talking about COVID in the way it makes us rethink what? Reading, talking, and working. And that leads us to our third participant today. That's Ilana Gershon, who's relatively new to Rice University. She's the Herbert S. Autry Professor of Anthropology, and recently published a book entitled The Pandemic Workplace, How People Learn to Be Citizens in the Office. I think in only 2 years, we've probably logged, 2-3 dozen hours of conversation. So a great colleague to have. Ilana, your book is about the transformation of this third category of everyday life, by which you mean places where we're spending our time, right? Everyday life during COVID. At the same, as you note as well, that question about what changed in COVID, social isolation, we'll talk about working from home, that question assumes we know what the workplace is that's being transformed. We start with the normal and we find the abnormal. You don't start with the workplace as an obvious thing. You start with the workplace as a site structured by private law, structured by notions of governance that are, not really democratic, but structured also and necessarily by ongoing communication. What is this workplace that faced COVID, and why does this background matter to our discussion of COVID in the workplace?
So, Carl, thank you very much for having me. This is a complete delight to be able to talk to you about a book that was really written during the pandemic in a flurry, because I really hated writing it, and so I would give myself 25 minutes at the end of the night to actually work on it, and found many ways to procrastinate during the writing that I was supposed to be doing. I love the fact that you ask me to define, because I try to avoid defining every chance I can get. And I thought, this really was not right, that I should skirt the definition. So I want to tell you what is, for what an anthropologist is going to think a workplace is. A workplace is a community of practice that is built on a stage of contracts. But what does it mean to be a community of practice? It means to be a community engaged in socialization constantly and over again, having newcomers coming in all the time that are engaging with old timers, that as the newcomers think about what is happening and the old timers understand what is happening, they're rewriting how dynamics should go, what the social interaction should be. And to ask this question about what the workplace is in the pandemic meant that I began to realize that the workplace is the site where Americans are learning their political imagination these days. Now, I'm thinking this in the footsteps of Tocqueville, who I want to claim as a great French ethnographer. An early French ethnographer who realized that you couldn't just become democratic, you had to learn how to move beyond your family interests or your own selfish interests to start thinking about the common good. And he thought Americans did this in civil society moments. But we kind of know from Robert Putnam, and then Nina Eliasov has this beautifully titled book, Avoiding Politics, that people aren't aren't engaging in civil society in a way that is teaching them necessarily how to think about the common good. And so what I began to notice was that people are learning this in the workplace. And this is something that should give everybody pause. Because most workplaces, after all, are geared towards making a profit. So what does it mean that you're learning to think about a common good in a space where you're making a profit? And neoliberal workplaces are now structured around the fact that most major corporate decisions are being made only with shareholders' interests in mind. And so this too is changing what the common good can be or should be. And most workplaces are also lying on a continuum between democracy and autocracy, and not always cohesively so. So you can have some decisions that are made in a workplace that are more made in ways that people experience as more democratic than others. And sometimes the decisions feel like they're made more autocratically. And it often depends on your structural role in the workplace. And so what I was able to do by interviewing people during the pandemic about what it was like for them to work in person during the pandemic and what they thought about the decisions that were getting made in their workplace, I was suddenly able to interview all these really savvy social analysts who had been fish in water that suddenly the pandemic made them have to rethink all the ways in which decisions were getting made in the workplace and suddenly notice what was going on, and it turned out be very wonderfully critical and ready for an anthropologist to ask them what was going on.
Thank you. Let me turn back to Krista now. I think it makes sense to go back to Krista because we're talking not just about formal institutions, about informal ones, as the ones that are like holding this everyday life together. And I want to talk about another phrase. You're ready for it. We're talking about the feminist rest stop. And when I think about a rest stop, I don't know about you, my image is a concrete structure with a bathroom inside and cars outside. And it says every time she's using these words, we're suddenly seeing a different meaning come out of it. You're using these words as a way to embed in this image the idea of stopping. We're putting back with this COVID moment, stopping, resting, thinking, and communicating in a way that seems to imply a transformative potential. So I'm passing it back to you to ask if you can think of maybe a few favorite moments in your reviews, a few, let's call them rest stop experiences in this redefined notion of a rest stop, not my image. What would those images be?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to say something, and then Priscilla Ibarra is going to say something to put into practice our collaborative relations. So in terms of not necessarily a favorite moment, but an important moment for the book that was a feminist rest stop, I want to tell you about an interview with Amy Hamilton in Santa Fe, where she was raised, because it was an occasion for her and for us to think together about being white women and being a white woman, a white feminist, working as a scholar in Indigenous studies, a non-Indigenous scholar in Indigenous studies. So she talks in the interview about the need to identify herself as a white woman in the classroom when she's teaching Indigenous studies topics, because a lot of times the students otherwise are confused. If she doesn't, they think she's Indigenous. And so she's thinking aloud in the interview about, why did I do that for a long time? Why did I allow that confusion to persist? Was I, in a way, trying to, quote unquote, play Indian? Was I not really trying to deal with being white? And that conversation bleeds into a different one about earlier being raised in Santa Fe. And this is one of the ways in which place helps us to account for our histories, where she says, you know, when I was a girl, I didn't really want to be a Sanchez. I didn't really want to be a white girl. I wanted to be a Sanchez, because then I would have belonged. But as a white girl, I just didn't feel like I had a history. So she and I go back and forth about this, and it's a difficult conversation. It's a risky conversation, which she allows to stand on the page, which has a lot of integrity. And at the end of it, I say, oh, this is a kind of resting place for us as white women and white feminists with each other, where we're not pretending we can somehow be above the fray. And it's an important conversation for me in the book personally, because after that, I'm able to really hold the line with some of the other women that I interview, so that we come at this question of whiteness through a kind of feminist refusal to engage, to allow ourselves to behave in white fragility kinds of ways. And this is really important, because if the goal of our network is coalitional feminism, that just doesn't work with white fragility. So, and then Priscilla.
Thank you. It's an honor to be participating in this book project and in this panel today. As a queer Chicana participant and interviewee in this project, I can reflect on the concept of feminist rest area and how it functions to support creativity, to create new knowledge, to cultivate community as a space apart, a byway of sorts, as we've been talking about it here. But it's also important to say that these are not spaces that are completely away from the pressures of racial capitalism and settler colonialism, as we just heard. You can still hear the giant diesel truck of patriarchy blowing by. You can still hear the road rage honks of ableism and homophobia blasting. And eventually you have to get back on the road with those diesels and honking cars and feel lucky you got a break and you gain some stamina to withstand the road, and maybe start to imagine more ways to build in these breaks. But on the whole, we still exist in these conditions of pressure, hierarchy, linearity. But thank goodness that we get to, even for brief times, cultivate a place apart that becomes its own place to inhabit with its own code of behavior. I would say relationality, reciprocity, accountability are very important as part of this code. These practices have enabled my own research and creativity as a scholar who documents Mexican American contributions to environmental studies. Growing up, I never identified with environmentalism. I didn't see a place for myself in the environmental movement. I didn't necessarily feel left out. I just didn't identify with it. It felt alien in the same way that many mainstream phenomena felt apart from my everyday experiences. Television and movies, and manifest destiny, remember the Alamo types of literature and histories we read at school. From very early on, popular culture and curricula trained me to hold myself apart as a brown queer girl, to keep my stories to myself. In graduate studies, first at UCLA and then in large part here at Rice with Krista Comer and Jose Aranda, I learned to step into my Mexican American culture's histories and narratives. I realized that there was very little representation of Mexican American cosmologies and eco-criticism, so I decided to write a literary history of Mexican American environmental writing. And this was difficult for many reasons, including that I had to reckon with how the concept of environment, with its presupposition of separation between humans and nature, did not fit with my culture's relations with nature. The environmental humanities lacked the vocabulary I needed to discuss what I found in Mexican American and Chicana literature. But I found that vocabulary in feminist, Latin American, and indigenous philosophies, which recognize that being apart, a decolonial option, is its own place to be. So the sense of finding a place apart, a place of fugitivity, a feminist rest area, becomes very important to creating new knowledge that isn't even sometimes necessarily new, but certainly new to the academy.
Thank you very much. And actually, I really enjoyed the way Priscilla brought us back to this ambiguous situation of the rest stop, right? We don't lose this image of this concrete facility and the semis going by. That leads us directly back, believe it or not, to Julie, right? No, it really does, because you heard part of what Julie is working on. It's a very personal book with a distant style, and which really ends up moving from reading and experiencing stereotypes to asking about the why in a very explicit way. And the why has everything to do with institutions, how they work, why they work, sometimes because of bad faith, sometimes not, right? That was what I found really interesting. So I wanted to ask you, how and why do markets and libraries and publishing houses reproduce past views instead of reacting to or even facilitating change?
Okay, thanks, Carl. I have to do a little detour, though, before I answer your question. And the detour is to just give a brief explanation about what's French about French children's literature. So I think that will be helpful to answer the question. The industry is prolific, innovative, profitable, 18,500 children's literature books published a year. The field is highly professionalized. There are unions for authors, unions for publishers, hundreds of book fairs, prizes, etc. And although, of course, it's still struggling for legitimacy vis-a-vis adult culture, still there's major recognition for children's literature. In the French National Library, there's a reading room, a journal, and an entire division dedicated to children's literature. In France, there's a belief that books are cultural artifacts, not necessarily commercial products. There's a belief that children deserve quality books. You might say that's true in many other countries too, but French publishers are falling over each other, trying to outdo each other in terms of superior quality in a way that I don't think you just see in the US. There's also a law dating since 1989, the single price of book law. So the government has decided that books cannot be dramatically discounted. And so that's a really important protection, not just for publishers and small publishers, but actually for small bookstores. So in French cities, there's a swath of specialized children's literature bookstores that you just don't see here. I mentioned state subsidies for unprofitable book projects, or lower sales tax on books and magazines for children. Anyway, all this unique market and cultural background might lead one to expect to see progressive representations of gender in the literature. But there are other factors that actually favor the reproduction of outdated or just gendered stereotypes, and why they still exist in 21st century literature. So I'll just highlight 5. The first is this French concept of universalism, which some of you might be familiar with. It's usually in contrast to American multiculturalism, but the idea is that equality is best achieved through blindness to color, to gender, to race. So in this view, feminism is a divisive categorization that actually threatens equality. Activism in favor of any social category is problematic in this view. It makes for an agenda, particularly in literature, that is not purely creative. And so the second argument I make is that publishers put this primordial emphasis on creativity in fictional literature. They refuse to intervene in the creation of authors and illustrators. And this no-touch policy actually enables stereotypes, automatisms, imbalances to proceed to publication unchallenged. There's another reason for resistance to advocacy in literature, not just the emphasis on creativity, but also it stems from the suspicion of children's literature as historically Catholic and moralistic, and that was resoundingly rejected in the 1970s when French children's literature took a turn to avant-gardism, a rebirth of modern, that just wholeheartedly rejected any kind of agenda in children's literature. Fourth factor, fear of losing boy readers. This is something I saw especially in the press industry where they have data on their subscribers. But there's this widespread assumption that girl readers are willing to do what I call gender jumping, to project themselves into the body or the personality of a character that they're reading about. But the assumption is that boys won't do this. And this has actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy because there are so many boy characters that girl readers have to do this. And so even though the press has, compared to the book industry, a more inclusive rhetoric, a more openness to inclusiveness, and even though they have a built-in audience, I found that male-centric and stereotypical content is just as developed in magazines as it is in picture books to attract this elusive boy reader. And actual girl readers that exist are being taken for granted. And finally, because I have been interested in professionalization, the final factor I think that thwarts gender neutral or gender equal representations in the 21st century is that despite good intentions, librarians and teachers are disempowered by the institutional structures that I look at. Notably, they have inadequate training in children's literature, and they just don't have much agency to customize the supply of literature to their constituents. So, thanks.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I'm going to switch back to Ilana now. I'm going to change the flow a little bit, although I'm going to talk about professionalization as well, but of you as a cultural anthropologist. It's going to talk about the how of your project. You think about cultural anthropology involving observation and communication, empathy, if not sympathy, and really a subtle understanding of the other person or the community under consideration, and yet you're carrying out your interviews under COVID, where people are distanced, they're on Zoom. I don't know about you, do you have good empathetic communication in Zoom, or do you want to, just turn it off? I want to turn it off. That's different. Masks, distance communication, a disrupted workplace. How did these changed circumstances affect your investigation? What did you see yourself doing differently as a cultural anthropologist?
Well, I want to be very clear that I don't think anybody should do the project the way I did it if you aren't stuck at home in a pandemic trying desperately to avoid doom scrolling. Like there was kind of in the first 2 or 3 months of the pandemic, I couldn't read, I couldn't write. I was supposed to be on sabbatical doing a project on something that was deadly to interview people about. It would have been great to observe people, but it turned out to be a project that was kind of deadly to try to talk to people about. And yet all I could really do was interview people. So I began interviewing people with the commitment to the God of fieldwork, that if I sacrificed enough time to the God of fieldwork and interviewed enough people, then maybe I would get in return paragraphs and possibly even a book. But what I did as an interview, as a project, was I just welcomed whoever would talk to me. My call was, are you working in person during the pandemic, and will you talk to me about it? And what that meant was that I talked to people in Hawaii and in Maine. I didn't talk to anybody, I wasn't focusing on one particular career, so I talked to a pest control exterminator and NYPD cop, I talked to beauticians, I talked to teachers, doctors, nurses, and principals, superintendents, supermarket workers. I was talking to everybody and across the country. And I think normally people in my line of work focus on a profession or focus on a region. Everything I got was just this kind of very broad overview. The other thing that I found really interesting was how I found people to interview. At first, I was just asking my friends if they happened to know anybody who would be interested in talking to me. But I realized that if you go on social media sites to places where people love to give advice, so Facebook foodie groups or golden doodle breeding groups, and you say, I really would love to collect an oral history of your experience working in the pandemic, you get interviews.
That's great. So I want you all to notice something here. Julie hasn't said much about it, but Julie also did interviews. I work on dead people, so the interviews don't go too well, right? But these are three people who have done a lot of interviews, done interviews under difficult conditions, changed sometimes the way they work. And what really strikes me is that the book that comes out of in each case is very different. I wanted to ask you, just as a final question, throwing it out to you before we turn to the audience, at a more general level of writing, because this is about writing books, that's what we're talking about, a more general level of writing, how do you fit the interviews? How do you use them for a book? How do you structure the interviews for the book? Because you have to think about that before you even start. How do you initially interpret, review? You already talked a bit about processing the interviews. You have to transcribe at some point, right? How do you refocus them to produce a book, which means you're losing that immediacy of the interview, doing something with it, more or less in the different cases. So I'm really asking you about the particular challenges you faced in the process of working between interviewing and writing. I'm not going to call on any one of you. This is like the worst case scenario for students in the classroom. But if I'm quiet, they'll answer.
People are looking at me. All right. Well, one of the things that was unusual about our project is that we did the interviews and then we posted them to a blog. So the blog was the first draft of the book. And so there was a curation process that happened there. And then when we translated it into the book, there was another curation/revision process. And so the interview was 60 minutes. Jose Aranda did them on his iPad. We told people up front it would be 60 minutes, and we organized them eventually around the question, what is the where of here? And we tease that out in a lot of ways. What is the where of here? People have lots of responses to that. It's both an impressionistic kind of question, but it's also can be a material or bioregional or a social historical or et cetera kind of question. And so that was the angle in, because you're right, of course you have a lot of material, and so Zainab Abdali would transcribe these interviews, which itself is a kind of care work, and then she would send them to me, and then I would review them and start to shape them around this idea of the where of here. Yeah, I could probably say more, but yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go next. Yes? No. That should work? Yeah. So I conducted dozens of interviews with publishers, editors, librarians, teachers, authors, union leaders, civil servants in education. And I really valued that ethnographic piece of the project that was frankly necessary when working on contemporary social norms. So you may be surprised to learn that the French were the first to be suspicious of wokeism years before the MAGA movement. And in France, it is considered an American import. So approaching editors and publishers as an American academic interested in gender, you can imagine that I had to tread carefully. Brief anecdote, one editor who did warm up to me after our 3-hour interview confided in me. She said, "I was afraid you were going to be a gender Ayatollah." So on the other hand, in the magazine industry, I met editors at Bayard Press, which is one of the biggest publisher of multiple dozens of magazines for children and adults. They were extremely forthcoming. They claimed to be very conscious of gender equality at every level of their publishing process. And so the questions were able to take a different tone because of that. They invited me to come back and present my findings to their editorial team. They piled on a whole new subscription of magazines into my arms as I was leaving. But interestingly, when push came to shove, and I made a formal request a year later for permission to reproduce certain images from their 2014 magazines, they refused. So my chapter 5 is and refused on gender grounds, actually. So my chapter 5 is the only chapter devoid of imagery, and it would have included women in aprons, a lot of women in aprons, and girls in sexualized poses, for example. So I've barely begun to promote this book, but I expect to make some enemies, not in France, not academics, but in the professional world, and this is not something that gives me pleasure. My tone is very careful, and my evidence is overwhelming, so I really hope it will be the beginning of some kind of dialogue.
Lana, you have the last word before we open up to the audience. And yep.
I mean, you're asking anthropologists how they process interviews. Yeah, okay. So I am really jealous of the two of you because I had over 220 interviews. Because when you are really trying to avoid doom scrolling, this is the consequence. And so the way what I find interesting is that this actually is at the core of how I came up with the argument of my book. So on January 5th, I was having coffee with a much older colleague in anthropology who is notorious for being a perfectionist. And she asked me what I was doing, and I said, I'm starting to code my interviews, and it's taking so long. I have over 220 interviews. And she looked at me and said, "Stop it." And I said, Judy, what? What are you saying? And she's like, if you were my graduate student, I would tell you can only do 30. And then you have to stop coding. And I thought, the biggest perfectionist in my profession has just told me I am being more of a perfectionist than she is. This is ridiculous. January 6th happens. And on January 7th, I'm reading an article by Evan Osnos in The New Yorker, in which he is describing hanging out with the insurrectionists. And every quote he has is people talking about what they are doing in terms of the workplace. And he doesn't comment on this, but I'm reading this and realizing this is their political imagination is coming from the workplace, and I have all this detail. I have all this proof about it, and I suddenly saw the organization of my book and the chapters that I would have to write. And so I went through all my transcripts, just taking each paragraph or each story, saying, well, it could be in this chapter, and just putting it in a file for that chapter. And then I went back through and read these interviews and then figured out the arguments of the chapters that way.
All of us need to listen to these ways of doing books, especially if you have trouble. I like this last thing. I don't know if any of you have, when you're writing something, you got all this stuff. And there usually is really a moment when things start, when chaos starts finding its order. Mary, we have about 10 minutes. Okay, so I would like to open this up for questions right now, but only for about 10 minutes because we have wine and cheese and other things over there. And it's late and we're hungry. And furthermore, we can continue talking to the authors. Now, that does rely on all of you to provide the questions. Are there any questions?
I can be pretty loud.
Right.
Hi, Julie. My question's to you, and it's about language. And so when you were enumerating sort of 5 reasons or ways that you think about gender in your book, okay, I can do that if you really want me to, but I'm very loud. like one of the aspects that you didn't talk about is the gendering in French, so of the language. And I know that there's many ongoing conversations in France and in French culture about like how to gender for transgender individuals and that kind of thing. And this is the case in any languages. It happens in Spain, it's happening in Italy. And so I was interested that you didn't mention the gendered nature of French as a language. And I wondered if you could just speak more to that.
Okay. Should we take multiple questions or should I answer? Okay. Thank you. Yes, I didn't bring it up, but I do write about it. Inclusive language is the term used in French for efforts to deal with any Romance language that is much more complicated even than English. And so I saw that. So I do look at it, and I also look at. Maybe I should make this caveat right from the beginning. I'm looking so much at stereotypes about girls and boys, to say nothing of non-binary and everything in the middle. And the point is that there is no children's literature about that, so that would have been a very short book. But I do mention that hopefully this will pave the way for others to look at that when it's starting to develop. But I would say probably 10 books exist in that way. But inclusive language is part of that same conversation. And I noticed a few efforts to engage in inclusive language in magazines. They have a lot more opportunities when you're producing a monthly magazine each time to play a little bit with that. Picture books, really no, just absolutely not, especially those that make it into a book club, because they're already a selection of a selection. And book clubs that are distributed in public schools have all kinds of criteria to meet about literacy. And so that play with language, in fact, during the time of the research under review here, the Minister of Education in France passed some kind of directive to public schools saying that inclusive language could absolutely not be taught because it would hinder the learning of grammar. So it's an important topic. Thank you for bringing it up.
Difficult and ask him to hand you 2 mics to use. One is for our recording and one is so that your friends in the room can hear you. So please.
Okay, this question is also for Dr. Fette. If you did a 21st century USA children's literature review, what are your suspicions as to whether it would be the same or different, and how?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Actually, Carl knows, and Krista too, and maybe Randall. I originally wanted to make this book a comparison between French and American children's literature, partly because I didn't want to be the foreigner again who kept pointing fingers at France, first for being racist, now for being sexist. But an initial study, I did do an initial study comparing, and I found that there were hardly any differences to highlight. And the real problem is that although the book emphasizes what's exceptional about France, gender stereotypes in kids' hands remain a universal problem in the 21st century.
Hello, sorry, 2 mics. Maybe it's one question for all 3 of you, and it's just maybe from a feminist perspective, I guess, what's the evolution past, present? Like where feminism started, where it's gotten to today, and what does the future look like from your perspective?
I think where we are right now in the US, let's say, is at a moment of transformation around how we define feminism. If you look at the leadership of the women's marches, for instance, feminism has tried to understand that it conceived itself through a very white history, and that it needed to change that in order to have a much broader picture of what it means to end sexism. To end sexism, you have to end poverty, you have to end colonialism, which means you have to be aware that the world is not white middle-class American women. So I think that feminism has gotten that message, and it's in a period of transformation. I think, well, that's one thing to say. I don't know. Somebody help me out here. I just did a whole podcast on this topic. It's called Reading Power, but it's focused on surfing. So I'm trying to think of how to pivot there. It's failing me in the Kyle Morrow room.
You can attach it to surfing.
We can continue this with cheese and wine and
I just wonder what the motivation for the question is, actually.
I got the opportunity to work in this field, especially you guys spent your life here, and it's important to you. So I guess as maybe an outsider looking in, how do you guys see it? Like, how is it evolved? Because I don't know. And I definitely don't know. I have a gist of where we've been or going, but I definitely have no idea where it's going to go. But so I'm kind of curious from your perspective.
I see.
Maybe I don't know, maybe it's doing darts at the dartboard, but
No.
It's better than what I do. That's what
Well, thank you. I mean, I think where I hope it goes is that feminism learns to take leadership from people it hasn't listened to in the past. I think that's the future. That's the future for a lot of the movements, right? Climate justice movement, the movement around gun violence. We need to listen to different people and take seriously what they say in a whole different worldview. That would be, I think, transformational, and at least it would give us new information. So that would be one way I would think about it.
So I have a few more things to say, but before anything else, I think we need to thank them for a really great presentation. Before anything else, we also have to thank Mary Lowry, who put this together. She is, of course, the executive director of the Friends of Fondren Library, and she put it together with the help of Catherine Randall, who is here. Okay, so we can thank her when we get out there. This event was put on, of course, by the Friends of Fondren Library, which is a membership organization that provides financial support to the library, presents lectures, other things for our members. We're celebrating this year the 75th anniversary of the library itself. I don't know if you saw the display downstairs. This is my official invitation for you to join if you would like. I want to say why. And it's not just you ought to join because we got this great group of people up here. I've been here 31 years, or 62 semesters. And the library is my laboratory, the same with many of the professors here. Whether we're talking about books, and yes, books are essential for real scholarship, at least in humanities and social sciences. But also digital resources come through the library, and we can't discount the role of the experts, the librarians who help us. And the students have the same experiences. Whether they're the students who are not going into the humanities, they're still using the library without knowing it, either for the rooms or for the digital resources, or some of our students are delving into the millions of books in our collections. So I just want to say this is an important group supporting what I consider the heart of the university. We hope you will join us for future Friends of Fondren events. We got a couple coming up I want to mention to you. The next event will be a Meet the Author event with the author Justin Cronin, who's writer in residence here at Rice and author of the best-selling New York Times series, The Passage It Is. That'll be on February 12th. And on March 7th, we're honoring Kathleen and Robert Clark at the 2025 Friends of Fondren Library Gala. This information about these events, but also what you're most looking for, is the form allowing you to become a member. They're up there on the way out. They're outside the door? Outside the door. So with those remarks, thank you for being a great audience, and please join us across the hall for some wine and cheese.